So we've been looking at Paul. This is considered like his fourth missionary journey, as he's on his way to Rome, and he's been on trial, and he's going to be going through a series of trials. We've seen last week, we were talking about how he was standing before the people, and he was talking to them, and they kind of like rejected everything that he had to say, and he's basically, he knows that his ministry is coming to an end. His ministry is coming to an end, not because he's getting ready to retire, but he knows that he's going to die. He's probably one of the only apostles besides that knew that he was going to die when he was going to die. In other words, he knew that he was told that he was going to die delivering the gospel. And you know, when we look at Paul, what's interesting when we look at his life, you can put it right alongside of Christ. And although Christ went through a lot and Christ taught us a lot, Paul went through a lot of similar stuff that he did. He went through a lot of the persecution that he did, and yes, the other apostles did as well, but we see more about Paul, what happened to Paul and the persecutions that he received. We see that it was revealed to him that his death was going to help lead other people to Christ as well. And his last journey, he's continuing on. And so today we're going to start in verse 22, Acts 22, verse 30, and we're going to move through all of 23. And we're going to notice is that Paul kind of gives us or I shouldn't say kind of, but Paul gives us the idea of that we need to continue to move forward in our faith, no matter what, and it helps us to grow. And I know that all of us have had times when we're walking out and we're stepping out in faith that we've had discouragement. We've had people tell us that you're not doing what you should be doing. You're not following God's law. You're not following his direction. And we're going to look at some of the stuff that happened to Paul and some of the things that we can draw off of it to move forward. So let's take a look at verses. We'll start in chapter 22, verse 30. So the next day, now remember, the next day is when after Paul was taken away from the crowds, and he was brought into by the guards. It says the next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before him. And what they're talking about again is the guard. He wanted to know what's the accusations. He wanted to know why were they ready to kill Paul, because he wanted to be sure that he didn't have a criminal. He wanted to be sure he didn't have a criminal. So verse 1 or 23, it says, Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. You know, it's interesting, you know, as we look into these passages, you know, we get accused. How many of us have been accused by legalists? I mean, think about it. I mean, we're living in grace, right? And I hear one of the biggest things that we hear is that you're not living by the Sabbath day, right? Have we heard that? And the thing with living by the Sabbath means that you have to live it by the letter of the law. But the problem is that if you're going to live by one portion of the law, you need to live by the whole law. And legalists don't grasp that. But here's Paul. He's dealing with one of the legalists of the day, and the high priest, he smacked him. And why do you think he smacked him? He smacked him because he said, you know what, I'm living in good conscience. And the high priest said no. It was basically saying no. He smacked him as a sign of saying that you're lying. This is a way of saying that you're lying to everybody. You're lying to me. You're lying to God. You're lying to yourself, and you're lying to everybody. Picking it back up in verse 3, it says, Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and you command me to be struck contrary to the law. And do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And here's Paul pointing out to say, look, you're judging me by the law, but the way that you're punishing me by saying that I'm not living by the law is not the way it's supposed to be. And that's what legalists do. They come at us, though I was listening to No Other Doctrine yesterday, talking about the Sabbath, and one of the things that was brought up about how if you are living by the Sabbath, one of the rules of living by the Sabbath is do not kindle the fire. And what was being pointed out is what that scripture was saying is that we're not supposed to spark a fire in our fireplace to cook or that type of thing. And today, the way we would light it, if we would relate it, if we were to live by that term, is that we shouldn't go start our car because you're starting a fire. We shouldn't turn our lights because that's a little spark of fire, right? And the guy's argument is that the way that it's interpreted is that we shouldn't have an argument in our home or to have an argument with the family. But I was listening to this debate, this going back and forth, and what was interesting is here's Scott, he's calmly presenting what was going on, and here's this guy insisting that what is talking about don't kindle a fire is not to start an argument. This guy is doing exactly what he's saying you shouldn't be doing. And a lot of times that's what legalists do. Here he is, he's so right, and he's going to be right, and according to living by the Sabbath in his eyes, Saturday's a Sabbath. And so here he is kindling a fire according to the way he interprets it. So they throw things at you and they try to twist it around and try to justify saying that they're right in what they're doing and that you shouldn't be doing that. It's the idea of do as I say, not as I do. We can't do that, right? We should be living by God's grace, by Jesus' grace, and we should be living the way that he lived. And yes, it's hard. It's hard because our flesh, we react. Our flesh tends to be like, I can't do that. I can't accept that. I have a hard time. But Christ wants us to live with grace, with love, with forgiveness, with kindness, with patience. And so as we walk this walk of faith, it's a continuing learning process for us. So yes, we'll make mistakes. But we need to go on. And I kind of get the picture here when Paul said, God will strike you and because you're judging me by the law, but you're not punishing me by the law. I kind of think the picture that comes to mind is that even Paul was a man, and I think he reacted in anger. He's like, he probably yelled at him. And then what happens is here's picking up in verse 4, it says, and those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was a high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And Paul is pointing out to them and saying, if I'd known that he was a high priest, and I don't know why he wouldn't have known he was a high priest, other than the fact that maybe that he wasn't in the garbs he was supposed to be wearing. Or it could be that Paul just wasn't very familiar with that area as far as who the high priest of that area is, or it could be a combination of both. Because a high priest, they according to the law, they were supposed to be wearing garb. So here's another example of what happens. So if Paul didn't recognize him as being a high priest, he wasn't doing the things of the high priest. But Paul said this, had I known he was a leader, I would have given him respect, even if he was wrong. And that's something for us to think about. We all have leaders in our lives, including the current administration, that we don't agree with what they're doing. But we're supposed to still give them respect. Remember, God told us that we're to pray for our leaders because he's the one who put them there. So there's a reason why he put them there. And I believe that a lot of times that the leaders are put in place is to fulfill prophecy, is to help us to grow and to help us to walk in faith, to trust that God's got it under control. Because remember, he has it all, right? And it just helps us to learn. So picking back up in verse 6, but when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out to the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, and I am being judged. And he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there's no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, "We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." Now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled in pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. So here it's interesting to see the Roman guards are again interceding on Paul's part, pulling him and keeping him safe. But what did Paul do? He kind of played on the situation that was going on. He saw that there was Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, it says that the Sadducees, here's the thing, the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. And that's why they're sad, you see. And the Pharisees did. But Paul, being a Pharisee, being of the Pharisee sect, he played on that. And he used that. And he wanted to, again, I think part of it was, it's like, well, let's get them to come against themselves and then to see what their foolishness that they're doing, maybe. Maybe it was, maybe if we cause a little bit of dissension, maybe they'll let me go because they have no argument. Or maybe it's not so much to come against themselves like this, but to the point of saying, look, you guys, you have all these rules and regulations in place, and it's hard to figure out which way to go. And you have two sects. You literally have two sects. Well, there was actually three. There was the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and then the Essenes. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. And I can't remember what the Essenes, but they were a smaller sect of the Jewish leaders. So what you have is you have three different sets of rules coming in at you, and you have to live by. They tell you to live by these rules. And Paul's trying to point out is, you can't expect the people to live that way. Because if you expect the people to live that way, they're going to be confused, and they're going to be like worried about, is my dress long enough? Is my ankles covered? Am I got holes in my pants? Am I wearing the right shirt? Am I wearing the right tie? Is my hair trimmed the way it's supposed to be? Is my beard long, showing that I haven't shaved? And then what happens is because they're so focused on their appearance, or they're so focused on, are they living by the law, that they forget to have that relationship with Christ or God. And we can't do that. If we're so focused on the law, then we kind of get sidetracked. Do you guys remember the 2 commandments that Christ gave us? He said there's 2, and he said, the first one, he said, love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. That wraps up all the first 4 commandments of the 10 commandments. He didn't say you had to live by this. Commandment number 1, thou shalt not have any God before me. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And he said the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the 2, and it seems like he stressed love the most. He didn't say, forsake those commandments. He's saying, look at those commandments and see how it applies to those areas. And when we do that, we learn first that we have that relationship with him first. We learn how to love because he's loving us, and then we can love others. We work on this relationship first, then we can work on this relationship. If we keep him first, this will be the best. And it's hard, even in those times of struggle, even when those times of where we're lonely, we should be focusing on him. So here's a couple of things, a couple of points we can look at.